Hi everyone. In today's video, I am going to show you an example of how extraneous variables affect the dependent variable in a study and why we should take into account of these variables and address them as part of our research design. So let's get started, and I will also explain what do I mean by independent variable and dependent variable, and then what do we mean by the extraneous variable. So this example is an easy to understand one, and you can use the knowledge of derived from this video in the context of your own research study, which might be slightly more sophisticated, complicated, and of a much higher level than what I have discussed in the video. But I like to keep things simple and easy for us to understand so that any researcher at any level can use the knowledge. So let's start. So in today's research, let's take up an example firstly of an independent variable. So the research objective for the example that I'm going to discuss is to study the effects of marriage counseling service on marital problems among clients of an agency providing the counseling service. So here we have an example of an agency that provides marriage counseling service, and they want to research and find out if the counseling service they have provided have either reduced the marriage problems leading to a lesser rate of divorce among couples, or has it led to a higher rate of divorce. So that's how we can quantify it. So what can be an independent variable in this research? So the independent variable in this research would be the counseling service or the marriage counseling service that is being provided by the agency. So, and the dependent variable would be maybe the rate of divorce or rate of separation, or however you want to quantify the effect of a marriage counseling service. So here I have put independent variable, which has the cause supposed to be responsible for bringing about changes in the phenomena or situation. Remember, I am not saying the change is a less divorce. We don't know whether there is less divorce or more divorce unless we have actually investigated the problem and found out what the result was. Our hypothesis could be that marriage counseling service leads to lesser rate of divorce or more divorce, but it's up to you as a researcher as to what you want to derive. And the dependent variable in this case is the outcome or changes brought about by the introduction of an marriage counseling service by an individual. So if the individual or couple have sought the marriage counseling service, what are the outcome or changes that have been brought about by it? So how you define that outcome or changes? In my case, like I said, I defined it as the rate of divorce, but how you define it is completely up to you as a researcher. So this independent variable, which is the marriage counseling service, is causing an assumed effect on the dependent variable, which is the maybe the lesser rate of divorce. However, between these two variables, there are also these extraneous variables. What are extraneous variables? Now, extraneous variables are the variables uh, that have an effect on the dependent variable, but which have not been classified as the independent variable. So if you don't address for it, they might have an effect on the dependent variable, which will not allow you to come to the conclusion whether it was the independent variable that was causing the change in the dependent variable, or was it something else. So I will explain more as we go along. So again, I have just explained what I meant by the independent variable and dependent variable here. So I have given you an example, and let's now start to understand what can be examples of an extraneous variable. So again, you have the independent variable here as the marriage counseling service, and the dependent variable as the maybe a rate of divorce in couples. All right. So is the marriage counseling leading to lesser divorce, or are there variables known as extraneous variables which you have not accounted for? Those are the ones which are leading to lesser divorce or more divorce, whatever is your assumption in the couples. All right. So to make sure that we can establish that it is the counseling service that is leading to the less divorce or more divorce, we have to make sure that we address for these extraneous variables and justify to the examiner or reviewer that it was not the extraneous variables that caused a change in the dependent variable, it was only your independent variable. So if you can identify them and you can address for it, or maybe even account for it. So if it is the extraneous variable that is causing a change in the dependent variable, then just accept it. Your research evidence will show it, and you account for it, and you can show that to the examiner and reviewer. There is no problem with that. You don't have to always show that there was a direct relationship between independent and dependent variable, depending on the nature of your research. But if you are honest about the extraneous variables and you've accounted for it, you've addressed it, and then you can always reveal the results as to what you find actually in the research. So in this case, the extraneous variables would be several other factors which are operating in this real life situation and which may cause any or may affect changes in the dependent variable. In this case, these are the real life reasons as to why there could be a lesser rate in divorce, and not necessarily the counseling service which is causing that. So the first one could be if you have an experienced counselor which may identify or who may identify and address the issues as required. So it may not be the counseling service, it may be an experienced counselor. So what does this mean is that in your research, if you are trying to establish that it is the counseling service that is leading to less divorce, let's say for example. However, you have two counselors. In one case, the counselor was very experienced, and in the other case, the counselor is lesser experienced. So if it is very experienced counselor who can identify the issues and address them quickly, that might have led to the lesser rate of divorce. But your result might get conflicted when you are seeing the results of the less experienced counselor who was not able to identify the issue which led to the divorce. So in this case, it is not the counseling service which has increased the rate of divorce. It is the less experienced counselor. So if you had two equally experienced counselors or two highly competent counselors who can deliver or who can identify and address the issues quickly, then of course then you can say that it was the counseling service that was causing a reduction in divorce, and not the less experienced counselor who was actually increasing the rate of divorce. The other reason which divorce was avoided was that if the couple had a child, maybe unexpectedly, maybe expectedly, maybe the cause of problem between the couple was that they could not have a child, which was leading to marriage problems. Now, on one hand, you are providing the counseling service, but the reason they decided not to go through the divorce was because they had a child recently. So that was what changed their minds, not the counseling service. So when you are establishing the causation between the counseling service and the rate of divorce, you have to also identify the how many couples had children during the time period that the counseling was being provided. So you have to identify having a child also as an extraneous variable. So if even after having a child, the divorce went through, then of course you can say that the counseling service has a relationship with the rate of divorce. But if after having a child they decided not to go through the divorce, and this is shown in many couples, then again you have to address for that. So in your research findings, in your results, you have to write that although the counseling service led to a rate of reduction in divorce, however it was found that let's say out of 9 out of 10 couples had a child during the counseling service was provided, and so one extraneous variable which may have been influencing the result was the factor that they had a child. So that becomes a huge factor, significant factor in influencing your results. And the third reason could be self-realization, where the couples themselves realized that they have to address the issue in the marriage, and you can only find that out if you are conducting an interview of the couple and you ask them as to why they decided not to go through a divorce, and if the reason they give is that it was our self-realization and not the counseling service, then again that becomes a important point. Or they engaged in maybe some kind of a meditation retreat, or some other kind of retreat, services of another retreat that they engaged in, and you didn't account for it. So apart from your marriage counseling services, they were also engaging services of a third party that you have to take into account, which may have influenced the decision not to separate or divorce from one another, and that is again something that you have to take into account. Effective communication, where couples have discussed and resolved issues listen to the counselor's advice and follow suggested ideas could be another variable. And again, this is only something that you can find out if you interview the couple and you ask them probing questions to determine what was it that led to them not separating. In this case, of course, it can be related to the counseling service, but it is very important for you to be able to segregate that was it the counselor's advice which helped them to reflect on how they can communicate and resolve issues, or was it something that they decided to do on their own, had no relation with the counseling service. So these are all kind of a qualitative research study where you have to investigate, you have to probe, but at the end of the day you have to identify this as a variable. And again, these are examples, these are variables that you have to identify and address for. The more extraneous variables you can identify and address in your research, the better is the rigor of your research. The examiners or the reviewers who are reading your research will be very pleased to see how you have not only identified them but also addressed them and accounted for it when required in discussing the research findings or the final results of your research study. One more could be that the couple was themselves self-motivated or motivated by external factors. For example, the couple decided not to divorce because they were having financial issues. So maybe they realized that if they separate, they financially well off, and they need each other to support each other's financially. Or maybe it was the parents who interfered and intervened, and they decided that the couple should not divorce. It had no correlation to your counseling services, or had no direct cause and effect relationship with the counseling services that was being provided. Again, maybe something that will be probed and found out only during a qualitative interview, probing interview, where you try to find out why a couple decided not to separate, and to make sure that there was no other reason other than the counseling service provided. Another reason that a person could have led to a divorce was having a romantic interest in someone else, or maybe they had a romantic interest which fizzled out, because of which they decided not to go through the divorce, and this has nothing to do with the counseling service. So you may think that a couple decided, you may have given the best counseling service, and in 9 out of the 10 cases the couples did not divorce. However, you realize that the same counselor has also advised another couple who went through the divorce, and now you're trying to find out why this particular couple went through, and sometimes we call them outliers, which you cannot explain, but outliers can be explained if you probe into it. So if you probe and you realize, oh, it was because someone was one of the, one person out of the couple was already in love with someone, and they went through it anyway, and no amount of counseling could have resolved the divorce, then that is the way you address it, that yes, our counseling services are effective, unless of course someone is completely in love with someone else, and no matter how much you have counseled them, who would have counseled them, and the best counseling services or retreats would not have resolved that issue. And finally, if the financial condition of the couple had improved, and their main point of conflict, or the why they were clashing with each other was because they were having financial issues, and once it got resolved, they decided not to divorce or not to separate, had nothing to do with the counseling services the agency had provided. And again, this could be a factor that you have to address for. So remember, when you are establishing a relationship between an independent variable and dependent variable, you always have to identify the extraneous variables and identify ways to address them or account for them, and make sure that when you're discussing the research results and findings, it is very clear to the examiner and reviewer that your results are based on an unbiased investigation of relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable, and you have honestly accounted for the extraneous variables and how they may have influence. Sometimes you will not find a conclusive answer as to whether it was the extraneous variable or whether it was the independent variable, but if you account for it honestly, if you discuss the results honestly, then the examiner and reviewer will be happy with what you have presented to them. So I hope this was a useful video for you to understand the relationship between independent and dependent variable, and how the extraneous variable can influence the dependent variable. And there will always be extraneous variables. Sometimes you can just identify them through a quantitative methodology, surveys, and sometimes you have to probe into it through qualitative surveys or in-depth interviews. Thank you for watching today's video, and subscribe, like, share, and I look forward to your comments and feedback to this video as well. All the best with your studies. Bye for now.